After 10 years of publication, My Hero Academia has finally come to a close to a lot of mixed reviews. A lot of people aren't really happy with the conclusion of the story. Now, personally, I think that this is probably the best end to a manga, the best conclusion thematically that we have gotten in the last 2 decades. In this video, I'm going to quickly go over a lot of the complaints I see online and sort of add some context from the story, which explains why this end, the conclusion of Izuku Midoriya's story, is straight up peak. Y'all just have no reading comprehension. So the first big thing I see is that people that are upset that Izuku did not keep his quirk. When we look at the story in large, especially with the added context of All for One's backstory that we got in the last couple chapters of the war, superhero society, heroes and villains, they are just extensions of the ideological battle between All for One and One for All. All for One essentially has the ideological standing that people with quirks, the strong, should take advantage of the weak and do whatever they want. And we see that passed on to Shigaraki, who essentially is still in the League of Villains. There are people who were left out, who were abandoned by society, and now want to live however they want, no matter what that means. They are opposed by heroes, or One for All, which uses that power. You use your quirk to defend the weak, to ensure that villains or evil cannot run freely. In my mind, it makes perfect sense that Izuku had to lose his quirk. One cannot exist without the other. All for One and One for All are essentially the same quirk, and that's touched on multiple times in the story and is brought up specifically by Bakugo. They are inherently intertwined. The battle, which has been decades in the making between the two quirks, is the reason why superhero society is as corrupted and as dangerous as it is. So by destroying All for One at the cost of One for All, it sort of brings everything to a close. This decades and decades of violence, this ideological war, has now come to an end. It's perfectly reasonable that Izuku had to lose his quirk. It existed to stop All for One. It existed to defend the weak, and he achieved that goal. The quirk had served its purpose, and it has now moved on. It's gone. With both of these quirks gone, which of course, like I've said, are the source of all of society's problems, at least when it pertains to superhumans and meta abilities, they can now move into creating a better society. The second big point that I see that people are upset about is generally that Izuku doesn't receive any recognition for his contributions or for ending the war. I can understand that. I do think it's a little disappointing. Of course, with a shonen manga, the main character always becomes like a beloved, almost deity figure. Everyone loves them. Everybody sees how cool they are. And we didn't really get that with Izuku. But that's never who Izuku was. He's the kid that ran in to save his friend without a quirk. He's always been humble. He's always done what had to be done. He was never there for the fame. He was never there to be beloved or have money or be famous. He wanted to do what was right. He wanted to be a true hero, which is exactly what he was. His impact and his legacy on the world is so monumental that it's a part of everyday life. He has been so influential that a statue would be a disservice. It would not encapsulate just how beloved, just how well-known Izuku truly is. And we see that sentiment confirmed in one of the epilogue chapters where an older woman reaches out to what would be a new Shigaraki and says, I can't ignore somebody in need of help. I need to reach out my hand because Izuku Midoriya showed us a better way. The entire world is different. On a global scale, everything has changed. Everyone is reaching out a hand to be a hero themselves, and it's because Izuku showed them it was possible. That the battle between heroes and villains, the sort of stage, so to speak, of All Might, of heroes rising up to crush villains, it's a never-ending cycle of violence, right? Now that's part of why All Might wasn't successful in his goal to end One for All, or to be that symbol of peace. People became reliant on him. He would crush villains when they appeared, but he didn't really solve that problem. He didn't get to the root of the issue, which is a lot of these people, a lot of the villains, especially Shigaraki, were people who were abandoned by society. They were abandoned by their family, and no one was there to help them. No one reached out a hand to save them. So they fell into villainy. They aren't inherently evil. They're people that have no other choice. They've been beaten and bruised and battered. They're suffering from mental issues, from like PTSD. And when the world sees them as a villain, when they are nothing but evil, they're going to play that role. You know, you can't, it's sort of that idea of I can't change what I am. Everyone hates me, so I'm going to destroy it all, which is exactly what the League of Villains' main objective was. By Izuku changing that, by changing the way people see heroes and villains, by changing the way people live their lives, by reaching out a hand, by being compassionate, by understanding that the world isn't black and white, which is something Izuku said himself to Lady Nagant, it changes everything. The whole world is a better place, and they all know it's because of Izuku Midoriya. In a grander scheme as well, it also makes sense, at least in the world, that he's not super rich or famous, or he doesn't have millions and millions of fans like All Might, because All Might was a hero for decades. People saw him everywhere. They loved him. There were so many fights or different situations where it was like, yeah, All Might's unbeatable. All Might's awesome. Right? He had time to cultivate this almost grandiose sense of self. Izuku had One for All for a single year, his freshman year of high school. And a lot of people, not just in Japan but across the world, didn't even know who he was or what his quirk was, what he was about. They didn't know any of that until they saw the live stream of him fighting Shigaraki. So he didn't have the time to create this brand, right? Because a lot of people didn't know who he was up until the very end of his story. Personally, it's just peak. It's just straight up peak. I don't see why so many people are pissed or think that it's bad writing that he had to lose his power to obtain his ultimate goal. When you look at other manga animes like Full Metal Alchemist, where Edward has to give up alchemy to achieve his goal, people say that that's incredible. It's awesome. And in a lot of ways, this is the same way. Both Edward Elric and Izuku Midoriya had to give up the very thing that allowed them to chase their goal in order to ultimately obtain it. But one of these characters is treated entirely different than the other. It sounds like a reading comprehension problem to me, I'm not gonna lie, because this shit was fucking best manga ever. Also, I predicted the whole story. I shit you not. Years in advance. When Izuku vs. Overhaul first came out, in the anime, because I wasn't reading the manga yet, you see that vision of Night Eye looking into All Might's future, and he says that you're gonna meet a horrific end against a monstrous villain. Even back then, I predicted, before anything was really known about the story, about the quirks, like One for All for One, before any of that, I predicted that Night Eye was actually tapping into the Vestiges world, and he wasn't seeing All Might's death. He wasn't seeing the end of All Might at a monstrous villain. He was seeing the end of One for All, the end of the quirk against a monstrous evil villain, which is what happened. The quirk came to its end fighting Shigaraki, which is the most dangerous, most, quote, evil villain the world had ever known. I also predicted even back then that Izuku was going to be the last wielder of the quirk, sort of running in tandem with that theory of the quirk ending at the end of the story. The only thing I don't really like about My Hero's ending, the only real thing I don't like, is that they never addressed the quirk doomsday theory. Horikoshi never really circled back to talk about that. And now that the manga's over, we're never going to get an explanation for it. Even though that was a very valid story point, that humans were evolving, quirks were evolving to the point that our bodies couldn't keep up. And with Shigaraki, even with a super augmented, super strength body, even that super body, that like one of a kind, that couldn't even contain all of the power inside of his body. So that's one thing I would have liked to see addressed, but I guess we'll just never know.